Made in America, the supply chain revolution, the auto industry reborn. The breaking point. The year was 2020, and the world stood still. The COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe, shuttering factories, closing ports, and grinding supply chains to a halt. In Dearborn, Michigan, the heart of Ford Motor Company's operations, assembly lines fell silent. The sprawling River Rouge complex, once a symbol of American industrial might, sat eerily quiet as workers stayed home and parts stopped arriving. Ford, like other automakers, faced an unprecedented crisis, a global supply chain stretched to its breaking point. For decades, the automotive industry had relied on a finely tuned, just-in-time, supply chain model, designed to minimize inventory costs by delivering parts exactly when needed. This lean approach, pioneered by Toyota and adopted by Ford, General Motors, and others, worked seamlessly in stable times. Parts flowed from suppliers across Asia, Europe, and North America, converging on assembly plants with clockwork precision. But the pandemic exposed the fragility of this system. Factories in China, a key source of semiconductors and other critical components, shut down early in 2020, triggering a domino effect. By March, Ford's plants were idled, not for lack of demand, but for lack of parts. The semiconductor shortage, in particular, became a choke point, as consumer electronics companies snapped up available chips, leaving automakers scrambling. It was like trying to build a car with half the pieces missing, recalls Sarah Thompson, a supply chain manager at Ford's Dearborn plant. We had chassis ready, but no chips for the infotainment systems or engine controls. Every day, we'd get updates, another delay, another cancelled shipment. It was chaos. The numbers told a grim story. In 2021 alone, global automakers, including Ford, cut production by an estimated 10.5 million vehicles due to chip shortages, with another 3.6 million lost in 2022. The average cost of a new car in the U.S. climbed to $48,759 by 2024, driven partly by supply constraints and rising material costs. Customers waited months for vehicles, and dealership lots sat empty. Ford's F-150, America's best-selling truck, faced production halts, costing the company billions in revenue. But the pandemic was only part of the problem. Geopolitical tensions, including U.S. China trade disputes, added fuel to the fire. Tariffs on Chinese imports, including automotive parts, increased costs and uncertainty. Natural disasters, like Hurricane Harvey in 2017, had already shown how vulnerable global supply chains could be, disrupting petrochemical plants critical to automotive manufacturing. The Red Sea crisis in 2024 further snarled shipping routes, forcing companies like Tesla and Volvo to suspend production in Europe due to delayed components. In boardrooms across Detroit, executives faced a reckoning. The global supply chain, once a marvel of efficiency, had become a liability. For Ford, a company with deep roots in American manufacturing, the crisis sparked a bold idea: what if the solution wasn't just to weather the storm, but to bring production back home? The seeds of a manufacturing resurgence were planted, driven by necessity and a vision of resilience. The roots of dependency. To understand why Ford and other automakers were so vulnerable, we need to rewind to the late 20th century. The 1980s and 1990s saw a seismic shift in manufacturing. Globalization promised lower costs, and companies like Ford embraced it, outsourcing parts production to countries with cheaper labor, like China, Mexico, and Southeast Asia. By 2000, a typical Ford vehicle contained components from dozens of countries. The Ford Mustang's 6-speed transmission, for example, was sourced from China, while the Buick Envision's engine came from Chinese factories. This global network was efficient but brittle. The automotive supply chain is a complex web of tiers. Tier 1 suppliers provide major components like engines and transmissions, Tier 2 suppliers deliver smaller parts like sensors, and Tier 3 suppliers provide raw materials like steel and plastic. A single disruption at any tier could halt production. When COVID-19 hit, the fragility of this system became undeniable. China's lockdown stopped chip production, Ukraine's conflict disrupted wiring harness supplies, and port delays in Los Angeles and Shanghai left parts stranded on ships. Ford's reliance on just-in-time inventory exacerbated the problem. Plants kept minimal stockpiles, assuming steady deliveries. When those deliveries stopped, production lines froze. "We were running so lean that we had no buffer," says Michael Rivera, a former logistics coordinator at Ford. A week's delay in a $10 sensor could shut down an entire factory. The human toll was equally stark. In 2020, U.S. manufacturing shed millions of jobs, with the automotive sector hit hard. Small and medium-sized suppliers, critical to the supply chain, struggled to stay afloat. In Ohio, a Tier 2 supplier of wiring harnesses laid off 200 workers when orders dried up. "We were told to wait it out," says Maria Lopez, a laid-off worker. But waiting doesn't pay the bills. The crisis exposed a deeper issue: America's manufacturing base had eroded. Between 2000 and 2010, the U.S. lost 5.7 million manufacturing jobs, a third of its workforce, as companies chased lower costs abroad. The U.S. auto industry, once a global powerhouse, relied heavily on foreign suppliers, leaving it exposed to disruptions beyond its control. Ford's leadership realized that rebuilding resilience would mean rethinking the entire supply chain, and bringing production back to American soil. The pivot to localization. By 2021, Ford was at a crossroads. CEO Jim Farley, a veteran of the auto industry, saw the supply chain crisis as a wake-up call. "We can't keep doing business this way," he declared in a company-wide address. "If we want to control our destiny, we need to control our supply chain." Ford's answer was a bold shift toward localization, bringing production closer to home to reduce reliance on volatile global networks. Localization wasn't a new idea, but it gained urgency. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, enacted in 2020, incentivized domestic production by requiring 75% of a vehicle's parts to originate in North America to qualify for tariff-free trade. Ford seized the opportunity, announcing plans to invest billions in U.S. manufacturing. In 2022, the company committed $11.4 billion to build electric vehicle, EV, and battery plants in Tennessee and Kentucky, creating 11,000 jobs. These Blue Oval City campuses aimed to produce batteries and vehicles domestically, reducing dependence on foreign chips and batteries. Ford wasn't alone. Hyundai announced a $5.8 billion steel plant in Louisiana to supply its EV factories in Georgia and Alabama. Nissan planned to maximize production at its Tennessee plant, capable of 640,000 vehicles annually. The push for localization was driven by necessity. Global disruptions showed no signs of abating, but also by opportunity. Producing closer to home could shorten lead times, cut tariff costs, and boost local economies. For Ford, localization meant rethinking its supply chain from the ground up. The company began stockpiling critical components like transmissions and batteries to buffer against disruptions. It also diversified its supplier base, moving away from single-source suppliers in Asia to multiple partners in North America. In Michigan, Ford partnered with local Tier 2 suppliers to produce sensors and wiring harnesses, reviving factories that had shuttered during the outsourcing boom. The transition wasn't easy. Localizing production required massive upfront investment, and U.S. labor costs were higher than in China or Mexico. A 2024 Deloitte report noted that lead times for production materials averaged 79 days, even as manufacturers invested in domestic capacity. Skilled labor shortages also posed a challenge. 56% of North American industry experts cited workforce shortages as a top concern. Ford responded by launching reskilling programs, training workers in advanced manufacturing techniques like 3D printing and robotics. Despite the hurdles, the benefits were clear. Localized production reduced shipping delays and tariff costs, while fostering innovation. Ford's new battery plants incorporated renewable energy, aligning with sustainability goals. "We're not just building cars," says Emily Chen, a Ford engineer. "We're building a system that can withstand the next crisis." The technology revolution. Localization wasn't just about geography, it was about technology. The supply chain crisis pushed Ford to embrace Industry 4.0, the integration of digital tools like artificial intelligence, AI, advanced analytics, and the Internet of Things, IoT, into manufacturing. These technologies promised greater visibility and control, allowing Ford to anticipate disruptions and optimize production. At Ford's Rouge Electric Vehicle Center, a control tower system monitors the supply chain in real time. Using AI, the system tracks parts from Tier 3 suppliers to the assembly line, flagging potential bottlenecks. "If a supplier in Ohio is running low on steel, we know before it impacts production," says David Kim, a supply chain analyst. "It's like having a weather radar for the supply chain." Digital twins, virtual models of factories, allowed Ford to simulate production scenarios and identify inefficiencies. In 2023, Ford used digital twins to redesign its Kentucky plant, cutting energy use by 15%. Advanced analytics also helped predict demand, reducing overstock and waste. A 2022 McKinsey survey found that 49% of supply chain leaders invested in analytics to tackle disruptions, with Ford at the forefront. Sustainability was another driver. Ford integrated renewable energy into its plants and collaborated with suppliers to reduce water and energy use. The company's EV push, including the F-150 Lightning, required batteries with complex supply chains. To secure materials like lithium and cobalt, Ford invested in domestic recycling programs, addressing the environmental impact of EV production. Technology also addressed labor shortages. Robotics and automation streamlined repetitive tasks, allowing workers to focus on high-skill roles. At Ford's Ohio plant, cobots, collaborative robots, work alongside humans to assemble battery packs, boosting efficiency. "The robots don't replace people," says plant manager Lisa Patel. "They free us to innovate." The human element. The resurgence of American manufacturing wasn't just about factories and technology, it was about people. In communities like Toledo, Ohio, and Louisville, Kentucky, Ford's investments brought jobs and hope. The Blue Oval City project in Tennessee promised 6,000 direct jobs and thousands more in the supply chain, revitalizing a region hit hard by deindustrialization. For workers like James Carter, a former auto worker laid off in 2008, the return of manufacturing was personal. "I thought those days were gone," he says, now employed at Ford's Kentucky battery plant. "This job gave me a second chance." Ford's reskilling programs taught Carter to operate advanced machinery, a far cry from the assembly lines of the past. But challenges remained. The U.S. faced a shortage of skilled workers, with 56% of industry experts citing labor shortages as a top issue. Ford partnered with community colleges to train workers in EV production and digital tools. In Michigan, a pilot program trained 500 workers in 6 months, blending classroom learning with hands-on experience. The cultural shift was significant. Ford emphasized employee engagement, holding regular feedback sessions to address workload concerns. "We're not just hiring workers," says HR Director Karen Lee. "We're building a workforce that feels invested in the future." Communities also benefited. In Stanton, Tennessee, Blue Oval City spurred growth in local businesses, from diners to hardware stores. "It's like the town woke up," says Maria Gomez, a local shop owner. A 2022 McKinsey report estimated that reviving U.S. manufacturing could add 1.5 million jobs, bolstering the middle class and strengthening local economies. The road ahead. By 2025, Ford's localization efforts were bearing fruit. Production delays dropped, and the F-150 Lightning became a symbol of American ingenuity. But the journey was far from over. Geopolitical risks, like potential tariffs on Mexican and Canadian imports, loomed large. The Red Sea crisis and ongoing trade tensions with China reminded Ford that global disruptions were still a threat. To stay resilient, Ford continued to diversify its supply chain, partnering with suppliers in Mexico and Canada to complement U.S. production. The company also invested in emerging markets, like Central and Eastern Europe, to balance cost and resilience. Sustainability remained a priority. Ford aimed to make its supply chain carbon neutral by 2035, aligning with stricter environmental regulations. The company explored the industrial metaverse, using virtual reality to optimize supply chain logistics. The broader impact was profound. Ford's shift inspired other automakers, from General Motors to Hyundai, to localize production. A 2023 McKinsey survey found that 66% of supply chain leaders increased nearshoring, with the automotive sector leading the charge. The U.S. auto industry, which accounts for 2 to 3% of GDP and over 3 million jobs, was poised for a renaissance. Yet challenges persisted. High capital costs, labor shortages, and the complexity of EV supply chains required ongoing innovation. This isn't a one-time fix, says CEO Jim Farley. It's a new way of doing business. Ford's journey reflected a larger truth: the supply chain revolution was about more than cars, it was about rebuilding America's industrial heart. Epilogue: A New American Dream. As the sun sets over Ford's River Rouge complex, the hum of machinery fills the air once more. Workers in hard hats move with purpose, assembling electric vehicles that represent a new era. The supply chain crisis of the early 2020s was a wake-up call, exposing the risks of globalization and sparking a movement to bring manufacturing home. Ford's story is one of resilience and reinvention. By localizing production, embracing technology, and investing in people, the company navigated a turbulent decade and emerged stronger. The auto industry, once battered by disruptions,